70 years ago, in the state of Georgia, a 9-year-old boy vanished in broad daylight, leaving no trace, plunging his family into a state of panic and pain that would linger across generations. Authorities at the time launched a large-scale investigation, pursuing every hypothesis from accident to abduction, but with no body, no decisive evidence, the case gradually slid into a deadlock and became a forgotten cold case. Yet through all those years, the boy's family never truly gave up hope, still believing that somewhere out there, their child might still be alive under a different fate. Then many decades later, from a very small doubt about personal identity and a seemingly private decision, an unexpected clue emerged, powerful enough to shake up the entire story that had been buried for half a century. Before diving deep into this shocking case, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love cold cases retold in an authentic way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. In 1955, Georgia still carried the appearance of a slow-paced and insular American South, where life was measured by the church bells every Sunday morning, by the end of shifts at factories and the railroad lines running through small towns, and by an almost absolute faith that the community was the safest shield for every family. In Macon, the seat of Bibb County, children still walked to parks, to school, or to friends' houses, rarely accompanied by adults, because in the minds of many parents of that era, danger was something that happened somewhere far away, not something that could slip into the familiar streets where everyone knew each other's names. The Price family lived in a modest wooden house not far from the town center, a typical working-class American family in the post-war years, with the father working shifts on the railroad, the mother staying home to care for the children, and actively participating in local church activities, their life revolving around routines, repeated to the point where nothing seemed able to break them. Richard Price, 9 years old, was the middle child in the family, a skinny boy with slightly tousled brown hair from running around, curious eyes, and a habit of observing the world around him with naive trust. Richard wasn't overly mischievous nor the quiet type. He was sociable, easy to talk to, familiar with every corner of the park, every small shop, and every shortcut home. Every afternoon after school or during summer days, Richard would often go out to play without much reminding, because the family believed he was old enough to find his way home, familiar enough to recognize what was normal and what wasn't, and lucky enough to grow up in an environment where adults still believed kindness was the default. Among those close to Richard, there was a relative who regularly witnessed his daily activities, someone accustomed to seeing Richard leave the house with a casual wave, a gentle reminder, then returning to their own work. That bond wasn't expressed through long words, but through a familiarity so deep that no one thought it could one day be severed. That afternoon began like any other, with summer sunlight casting a pale yellow over Macon streets. Richard left home in a relaxed mood, with no sign that it would be the last time he was seen in that familiar setting, until a small detail appeared, a moment that at the time no one considered alarming. A brief encounter, a slightly unusual situation, but still within the bounds that adults and children of that era deemed harmless. Richard reacted instinctively, as a child taught to be polite, to trust, to listen to adults, while the witness hesitated for a moment, feeling something not quite like usual, but not strong enough to break the deeply ingrained habit of reassurance. The initial danger signals, in hindsight, were all too small and too vague to be recognized right then. An unclear remark, a decision made too quickly, a complacency stemming from the belief that Macon was safe, and that Richard was just stepping a few paces beyond the usual line of sight. The moment Richard slipped out of the family's oversight was not noisy, no cries for help, no chaos, just a small gap appearing in the chain of normal activities, and that very silence delayed everyone's realization of the abnormality. As the sun began to set low and Richard still hadn't returned, the Price family initially reassured themselves that he was just caught up playing, that he'd appear any moment like before, but anxiety gradually replaced waiting, as time stretched longer than expected. Spontaneous searches began, calling Richard's name along the streets, asking neighbors, checking places he frequented, each answer vague, each other's memory uncertain, and it became increasingly clear that no one really knew where Richard had gone. As night fell and fragile hope dwindled, the Price family faced a choice they had never imagined in their quiet life, admitting this was no longer a normal delay, and in a state of panic mixed with fear, they turned to the police to report that their 9-year-old boy had vanished, officially marking the moment of peace for the family and for Richard as closed, though at that time, no one could foresee the long-lasting consequences ahead. The missing person call from the Price family was received at the Macon police station in an atmosphere accustomed to minor incidents in a peaceful southern town, where cases involving missing children were rare, and that very rarity made the initial response more cautious than urgent. The duty officer recorded the information using standard questions of that era, focusing on the last time Richard was seen, his age, appearance, and the possibility that he had simply stayed out playing too late, because in the common thinking of the 1950s, a 9-year-old going missing was often seen as a result of impulsiveness rather than a serious threat. The missing person file was created quickly but simply, without detailed forms or instant alert systems like decades later, just a few handwritten pages, a brief description, and a promise to check the surrounding area before jumping to conclusions. Police sent a small team to the Price family home to verify information, observe the surroundings, and listen to the accounts of relatives still in shock, trying to recall every small detail from the afternoon that had just passed while blaming themselves for not paying more attention to moments that seemed harmless. From the initial statements, the last route Richard usually took was sketched roughly, based on his daily habits rather than specific evidence, since no one could confirm for sure that Richard had taken that familiar path that day. The scene assessment was conducted in a limited scope, mainly around the residential area and places familiar to the boy, because at that time, the concept of preserving the scene in child missing cases was not yet prioritized, and the absence of clear traces further reinforced the assumption that nothing unusual had happened. In the first hours, police leaned toward the most common hypotheses of the era, that Richard might have gone playing with friends and forgotten to report home, or gotten lost, and would soon return by morning. An approach reflecting deep faith in the safety of the local community and in the self-awareness of children raised in that environment. However, alongside that reassurance, some officers began asking more cautious questions about the possibility that Richard had encountered an unforeseen situation, though no one was ready to name it abduction, as the concept was still too foreign to be immediately acknowledged in a town like Macon. Witnesses were questioned again, but their memories did not align, each recalling only fragmented and sometimes contradictory pieces, making the overall picture even blurrier, and that very inconsistency slowed the formation of a clear investigative direction. In that context, the decision for urgent action was carefully weighed, between the pressure to do something and the concern that escalating the situation too soon could cause unnecessary panic in the community. A very typical worry for law enforcement in the 1950s. Ultimately, police agreed that organizing checks of the surrounding area and contacting nearby units was necessary, not because they were certain of a specific danger, but because time was passing, and Richard still hadn't returned, a reality that could no longer be downplayed. The Price family was informed of these initial steps in a mood half hopeful, half uneasy, as they both looked to government intervention and sensed the limitations in how the case was being handled, a vague feeling that everything was moving slower than necessary. Throughout that night, investigative decisions were made based on individual officers' experience, rather than a standardized process, clearly reflecting the difference between the approach of this era and modern investigative standards. And though no one said it, the truth was that the newly activated investigation was starting in a state lacking information, tools, and even full awareness of the severity of what had occurred, a starting point that would shape everything that followed in the early days of the case. As dawn broke after the first night without Richard, the investigation entered the phase that later investigators would call the most decisive period, the first 48 hours, though in 1955, the concept wasn't yet systematized or emphasized as in modern training. But professional instinct still drove police to return to the places Richard was believed to have last appeared, with faint hope that daylight would reveal details obscured by night. The disappearance scene was re-identified, based on what family and neighbors remembered, a series of familiar spots where Richard often went: the park, the road home, small street corners where kids gathered, but all lacking a specific anchor point for precise narrowing, since no one could say for sure where Richard had stopped, whom he spoke to, or which way he turned that previous afternoon. Officers walked along that route, observing the ground, fences, paths, searching for any sign of unusual interruption, but the overly familiar landscape with nothing standing out quickly turned the effort into groping, where each step relied more on guesswork than evidence. Alongside area sweeps, police conducted direct interviews with those believed to have seen Richard on the day he vanished, from family members to neighbors, friends and people coincidentally nearby. And it was here that the first inconsistencies began to surface, not as deliberate lies, but as small differences in memory regarding timing, direction, whether Richard was alone or with someone. One witness claimed to have seen the boy leave the park earlier than usual. Another recalled Richard still playing when the sun hadn't fully set, details that seemed unimportant, but when placed together created a fragmented picture, making it hard for police to determine the accurate sequence of events. In that context, time pressure began weighing heavily on every decision, because each passing hour without new leads meant the chances of finding Richard safe diminished, though no one voiced that to the family. And this pressure forced investigators to act quickly, while trying to stay level-headed amid unverified information. Police returned to witnesses to re-ask the same questions in different ways, hoping repetition would clarify their memories, but results were often just details shifting with emotion and anxiety, a clear testament to the fragility of human memory in stressful situations. The Price family, meanwhile, was asked to stay home ready to answer more questions, and each time they heard a car stop outside, they hoped it was news of Richard, but subsequent exchanges mostly revolved around clarifying old habits, familiar routes, and the boys' relationships, all repeated to the point where nothing new emerged. The absence of physical evidence became the biggest obstacle in this phase, with no signs of struggle, no item left at a specific spot, no indication of violence, and that very emptiness trapped the investigation between two opposing possibilities. Either Richard had wandered farther than intended on his own, or he had encountered something that left no identifiable trace. Under the technical limitations of that era, there was no way to trace quickly or cross-verify information beyond relying on human accounts, and when those accounts didn't align, police had to accept that the picture they were piecing together might forever lack key pieces. Community pressure also began mounting as news of a missing child spread quickly through conversations, church and stores, creating an atmosphere of both worry and curiosity, forcing police to balance providing information with avoiding unnecessary panic. In those 48 hours, every small decision carried the sense that it could be the key to truth or a misstep pushing the case further from resolution, and it was in this brief but tense period that the investigation began revealing its fundamental limits, when time passed faster than evidence gathering, when human memory proved unreliable, and when Richard's absence became an ever harder void to fill, signaling that the road ahead would be anything but simple, though no one was ready to admit it yet. The deadlock that lasted through the first 48 hours forced the authorities and the Price family to acknowledge that relying solely on interviews and exploratory sweeps was no longer sufficient, and from that point, the search for Richard officially expanded beyond its initial scope to become a large-scale community effort, reflecting the way small southern U.S. towns in the 1950s typically confronted shared tragedies. The police called for assistance from local residents, church groups, schools and volunteers, willing to set aside their daily work to join the search. Because in an era lacking technology and specialized resources, manpower was still considered the most effective tool. Temporary search teams were formed, each group assigned to a specific area based on initial assumptions about the routes Richard might have taken, from the park he frequently visited, to nearby streets, and to less frequented spots, like vacant lots, forest edges, and trails leading out to the suburbs. The search radius expanded in concentric circles, starting from familiar locations and gradually spreading farther out, reflecting a common belief that if Richard was still nearby, he would be found quickly, and if not, widening the scope was inevitable. The search methods bore the strong imprint of the era, with lines of people walking parallel to each other, calling out Richard's name loudly, examining every bush, every ditch, every abandoned structure, while the police tried to record and coordinate to avoid missing any area, though in reality, this coordination remained spontaneous and unsystematic. The Price family participated in the search, not just as providers of information, but as direct members of the search teams, each step tied to the hope that just a little more effort, one more sweep, would lead them to their son, and their very presence motivated others, while also exposing the growing desperation as time passed without results. During the sweeps, some of Richard's personal belongings began to be discovered in locations that did not entirely match his usual routes, small items, but carrying great psychological weight, because they served as the first evidence that Richard had been there, while also raising questions about why they appeared in those places. The discovery of these items immediately drew police attention, forcing them to reconsider the assumption that Richard had simply wandered off, because their presence suggested he might have deviated from his normal path in an unnatural way, though no one was ready to draw firm conclusions. Initial hypotheses were adjusted in a more cautious direction, no longer focusing solely on the possibility that Richard would return on his own, but beginning to consider more complex scenarios, where he might have been led away, or encountered a situation beyond the coping ability of a 9-year-old child, and this shift changed the atmosphere of the search, from guarded optimism to palpable tension. However, each new clue came with new questions, because the locations of the personal items were not sufficient to determine exactly what had happened, and the fact that they were found after many people had already passed through the area also raised the possibility that the scene had been disturbed, reducing their value as evidence. The hopes of the Price family and the community thus fluctuated constantly, surging with new reports, and quickly subsiding when search teams returned empty-handed, an emotional cycle that repeatedly wore down the spirits of all involved. The police faced mounting pressure to maintain momentum in the search, because each passing day not only reduced the chances of finding Richard, but also heightened the sense that the case was slipping beyond control, and in that context, they had to weigh whether to continue expanding the search area or concentrate resources on areas with clues, a decision that was far from easy, since both options carried the risk of missing something. For the Macon community, this large-scale search became a collective experience, where unity was tested by the underlying fear that if a child could vanish like this, no one was truly safe, and that very unease drove many to participate more actively, even as they inwardly began preparing for the possibility that the outcome might not be what they hoped. Throughout those continuous days of searching, hope and disappointment intertwined, like two sides of the same coin, every small sign magnified by desperation, every void growing heavier in the absence of answers, and though the search continued on an ever larger scale, a simmering feeling began to creep into the minds of those involved, that finding Richard might not be as simple as they had once believed, and that what was unfolding could merely be the beginning of a much longer and far more painful process. The fact that the large-scale search yielded no concrete results, despite mobilizing the community's maximum resources, forced investigators to confront an increasingly clear reality that the initial simple scenarios were no longer sufficient to explain Richard's disappearance, and it was from this point that the accident hypothesis began to be seriously reconsidered. During the sweeps, police noted that the terrain where Richard usually went did not contain dangers significant enough for a 9-year-old child to vanish completely without leaving traces, especially since high-risk areas like riverbanks, forest edges, and wild lots had been checked multiple times by different search teams. If Richard had suffered an accident on the spot, there should at least have been some physical sign, some clue indicating he had lingered there or encountered trouble, but all they encountered was silence, a void that could not be filled by ordinary logic. The appearance of Richard's personal belongings in scattered locations further made the accident possibility less convincing, because they did not align with the behavior of a lost or injured child, instead suggesting that an unnatural movement had occurred, though no one could yet say how or why. As the accident possibility was gradually ruled out, the investigation had to turn to other frames of reference, and in that context, comparing it to similar cases that had occurred in the area became a necessary step, not to confirm a specific crime pattern, but to check whether Richard's case shared common features with other disappearances. Archived records showed that in the preceding years, several children in southern towns had also vanished under equally ambiguous circumstances, often in familiar public places with little or no signs of violence, and in many cases, the initial investigations had faced similar shortages of evidence. These incidents were not always labeled as abductions at the time, because societal perception then leaned toward believing children might wander farther than intended, but in retrospect, investigators recognized that the similarities in how the victims disappeared could not be ignored. Placing Richard's case alongside those records helped form a broader picture, in which his disappearance was no longer a completely isolated event, but could be part of a chain of unresolved incidents. From this comparison, the abduction hypothesis gradually came to the table, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that needed serious consideration if the investigation was to move forward. Building a hypothetical perpetrator profile in that context was more analytical than accusatory, because the police had no specific individual in hand, and could only sketch common characteristics based on behavior for someone capable of taking Richard. By this logic, the perpetrator would have to be calm and discreet enough not to draw attention, knowledgeable enough about child psychology to get a 9-year-old boy to go along without panic, and familiar enough or appearing reasonable in public spaces to avoid being remembered as a suspicious stranger. This was not the image of someone using obvious violence, but of a person capable of manipulating situations through words, natural demeanor, and exploiting the inherent trust of children and the community. This hypothetical profile reflected the investigative thinking of that era, when the concept of deliberate child predators was not yet systematized, and thus all analysis relied on inference, rather than scientific data. Based on these characteristics, an initial suspect list was formed, including individuals present in the area at the time Richard vanished, those with unclear schedules, or those the community began viewing with suspicion as harmless explanations ran out. However, this list-building process quickly revealed serious limitations, because most suspects were considered based on perception or circumstance, rather than direct evidence, and in a small town where relationships overlapped, suspecting one person also meant cracking community trust. Interrogations were conducted within the limits of that era, but without physical evidence to cross-reference. Questions could only probe general information, and most suspects provided nothing strong enough to bolster the abduction hypothesis. The absence of evidence became the central issue of this entire hypothesis, because while logic might support the possibility that Richard was taken by someone else, logic could not substitute for evidence in pursuing more aggressive investigative steps. No fingerprints, no direct witnesses to a crime, and no confessions to confirm the abduction scenario, leaving all suspicions in limbo, not strong enough to lead to charges, nor weak enough to be dismissed. It was in that void that the investigation fell into a stalemate, unable to revert to the weakened accident hypothesis on one hand, and unable to advance far with the abduction hypothesis due to lack of evidentiary foundation on the other. And this stalemate not only slowed the investigation, but also eroded the morale of those involved. Raising the abduction hypothesis also carried heavy psychological consequences, because it forced the Price family and community to face the possibility that Richard had been taken deliberately, a thought that shattered the sense of safety foundational to town life. Yet avoiding this hypothesis would only prolong the ambiguity and paralyze further efforts, and thus, despite much caution, the police had to continue digging in this direction, while fully aware they were entering an investigative territory where every step carried risk. Throughout this phase, the abduction hypothesis existed as a necessary yet fragile explanatory framework, necessary to keep the investigation from stalling, but fragile to the point that lacking just one more piece, it could collapse under the weight of evidentiary shortage, and that very fragility made the entire process tense, because every decision had to be carefully weighed in a context where mistakes affected not only the investigation's outcome, but also left lasting cracks in the desperate family and community, awaiting an answer. The placement of the abduction hypothesis on the table, though with much caution, led to a series of decisions to expand the investigation, because if Richard had truly been taken beyond Macon's familiar boundaries, then all efforts confined to the town would become meaningless. The police began contacting neighboring counties in central Georgia, sending out rudimentary descriptions of Richard, and requesting assistance in checking unusual reports related to children, a step reflecting the growing recognition that the case might exceed local jurisdiction. However, in the context of 1955, inter-county coordination remained manual and fragmented, relying heavily on goodwill and individual unit capabilities, rather than an efficient interconnected system, causing information to move slowly and easily get lost. The first leads from outside Macon began appearing in the form of calls reporting sightings of a boy resembling Richard at various locations, from gas stations and bus depots to small towns dozens of miles away. And though most of this information was speculative or stemmed from public anxiety, it still required police time and resources to verify, because no one dared overlook a possibility that could lead to finding the boy. Pursuing these weak leads quickly became a double-edged sword, because each new report sparked hope that it might be the breakthrough, but when unconfirmed, they pulled the investigation farther from the original focus, dispersing attention and making it increasingly difficult to connect the dots. Meanwhile, pressure from the Price family and the community continued to mount, because the inter-county expansion, though necessary, created a sense that Richard was getting farther away, a feeling that both pushed the police to act more decisively and made them prone to rushed decisions. It was in that context that narrowing down suspects began to be heavily influenced by the need to show that the investigation was progressing, and some individuals in the area were placed under suspicion not entirely based on evidence, but on coincidences of timing, location, or behaviors the community deemed unusual. One local suspect became the focus of attention for a considerable period, not because of direct evidence linking him to Richard's disappearance, but because his personal record was murky enough to fit the hypothetical perpetrator profile the police had previously constructed. Over-focusing on this suspect created a sense of progress, as interrogations were conducted repeatedly, and information thoroughly reviewed, but it also led to a dangerous tactical misstep, because investigative resources were poured into a single direction, while other possibilities were not fully explored. This misdirected focus not only wasted time but also eroded trust between the police and the community, because when the suspect could not be convincingly linked to the case, initial suspicions quickly turned into doubts about investigative competence, an invisible but heavy pressure on those handling the case. Tactical errors lay not only in choosing the wrong target to focus on, but also in how leads were evaluated and prioritized, with easily accessible and attention-grabbing information pursued first, while small, hard-to-verify details that might hold long-term value were overlooked for lacking immediate results. In conditions lacking technology and interconnected databases, each wrong decision had amplified impact, because revisiting an abandoned investigative path became nearly impossible as time passed and witness memories faded. Resource depletion became the most evident issue in this phase, not just in manpower and finances, but in the morale of participants, as officers worked in prolonged stress, constantly traveling between locations without concrete results. The Price family, though still fully cooperative, began to feel the fatigue and despair clearly, as each new police update brought brief hope quickly extinguished by the reality that the lead did not lead to Richard. The community, once united in the early search days, gradually returned to daily life, not because they had forgotten Richard, but because the indefinite prolongation of the investigation left them unsure how to respond, a quiet but meaningful withdrawal. Within the investigative team, strategy discussions grew more tense, as investigators weighed continuing to expand the scope with the risk of further wasting resources, or narrowing it to preserve what remained, a choice without a clear answer in the absence of decisive evidence. All these factors combined to create a phase of investigation that was both active and off-track, where effort was abundant but effectiveness steadily declined, and that very imbalance laid the groundwork for the feeling that the case was gradually slipping out of control, even as on the surface, the investigation was expanded and continued officially, reflecting the painful paradox of this period, that the more they did, the closer they came to an unavoidable dead end. After the intensive but misguided expanded investigation phase, reality gradually revealed itself in an undeniable way. The leads related to Richard's disappearance were drying up faster than new directions could be found, and the investigation, though still continuing in name, had begun to repeat itself. Information once considered promising had now either been checked and ruled out or become too vague to pursue further, forcing investigators to revisit old data in the hope that re-examining it from a different angle might reveal something overlooked. However, this review rarely yielded results, as most initial leads had been weak to begin with and heavily reliant on witness statements that over time began to change in ways difficult to control. Some witnesses, who had initially seemed certain about what they saw in the early days, now no longer maintained consistency, as their memories were influenced by community conversations, spreading news, and even the fear that they might have missed something important. Details once firmly asserted, such as timing, location, or Richard's direction of movement, began to be adjusted, sometimes by just a few minutes or a few steps, but in an investigation lacking a foundation of physical evidence, those small changes were enough to disrupt the entire chain of reasoning. Police were forced to confront the reality that the more they re-interviewed, the less reliable the witnesses' memories became. A familiar but unavoidable paradox in prolonged cases where human memory is not a fixed record, but a continuous process of reconstruction. Alongside the declining quality of statements, tips from elsewhere continued to pour in, mostly stemming from the goodwill of people in nearby towns and states who believed they had seen a boy resembling Richard somewhere, on a bus, in a store, or in an unfamiliar neighborhood. Each such tip required police to investigate, because ignoring even a slim possibility meant accepting an unacceptable risk. But as time after time, these tips were confirmed to be mistakes, they gradually lost investigative value and became more of a burden than an opportunity. Pursuing false tips not only consumed time and resources, but also weakened the ability to focus on core investigative directions, creating a loop in which the investigation was continually pulled away and then back to the starting point without making any significant progress. Within the investigative team, the sense of deadlock became increasingly evident. As meetings grew shorter, action proposals repeated what had been done before, and no one could propose a new direction convincing enough to change the situation. The investigation began to take on the appearance of a maintenance process rather than an effort to seek the truth, where steps were taken to prove the case had not been abandoned, rather than out of belief that they would lead to specific results. In that context, the Price family was gradually pushed to the sidelines of the investigative process, not by an official decision, but through a gradual reduction in communication, as updates became rarer and less informative, and police responses grew more generic. The initial cooperation, once a pillar of the investigation, now turned into a strained relationship, where the family tried to hold on to hope while clearly sensing that they were no longer at the center of the search effort, as before. Being sidelined not only intensified personal pain, but also deprived the Price family of the feeling that they were actively contributing to finding Richard, replacing it with a sense of helplessness, as all important decisions were made elsewhere, based on information they were no longer fully shared. The community, once the greatest source of support in the early days, also gradually withdrew, not from lack of concern, but because the indefinite prolongation of the case left them unsure how to respond without further hurting the victim's family. For the investigators, the dead end did not arrive as a clear moment, but as a slow process. As each small lead vanished, each hypothesis eroded, and each new decision carried the feeling that it was merely a repetition of prior efforts. In that state, the investigation still existed on paper, with actions still recorded, but the initial drive had faded, giving way to a tacit acknowledgement that without a new factor, a breakthrough piece of information, or a fundamental change in approach, finding the truth about Richard's disappearance would become increasingly remote. It was this unspoken acknowledgement that marked the point where the investigation, though not officially concluded, had truly entered a dead end, where every path seemed to lead back to the same unanswered question, and where the Price family had to face prolonged pain, in the deepening silence of those who had once promised to find answers for them. The prolonged silence following successive dead ends finally forced the investigative team to confront a decision no one wanted, but that was becoming increasingly unavoidable, ending the active investigation into Richard Price's disappearance, not because they believed the truth had been uncovered, but because every tool and every feasible direction within the constraints of that time had been exhausted to its limit. This decision was not made in a single meeting or under pressure from a specific deadline, but formed gradually through internal assessments, as each investigator had to admit there were no longer any new leads credible enough to justify continuing to mobilize resources actively. The investigation, which had already shifted to a maintenance state in the previous phase, was now officially deemed incapable of progressing without an entirely new factor, and in that context, continuing to pursue the case in the old way would only further drain resources without yielding real results. The Price family was informed of this decision in a brief but heavy conversation, where administrative explanations could not ease the sense of loss and helplessness, and though there was no loud public announcement, the message was clear: the investigation would no longer be prioritized as before. Along with this decision, legal procedures related to determining Richard's status began to be considered, and after a required waiting period, the boy was officially declared presumed dead, a cold but necessary legal term to resolve lingering administrative issues. This declaration did not mean affirming that Richard had died, but was an acknowledgement that with everything known at that time, the chance of finding him alive was extremely slim, and the legal system had to assign an official status to close unanswered questions. For the Price family, that moment carried the weight of an imposed ending, where hope was replaced by a permanent question mark, and personal grief was formalized on paper in a way they were never ready to accept. The Richard Price case file was closed according to procedure, with all documents, statements, search reports, and investigative notes organized, labeled, and moved to storage, where they would lie dormant among thousands of others, each folder representing an unfinished story. This archiving was technical and necessary for the system, but it also marked the end of all active investigative activity, as the case was no longer assigned to a specific investigator or dedicated team, but became a code in the system, ready to be reopened only if new information emerged. Legally, the investigation stopped here, with no more search warrants, no more periodic interviews, and no more budget allocated to pursuing unproven hypotheses, a reality reflecting the unavoidable limits of the justice system when facing cases lacking decisive evidence. Justice in this instance was not denied, but left suspended in an incomplete state, with no perpetrator prosecuted, no sentence handed down, and no clear answer to what really happened to Richard. For the Macon community, the case becoming a cold case gradually faded its presence in daily life. As time passed, conversations mentioning Richard grew rarer, and the collective memory of the missing 9-year-old was replaced by new concerns, though the initial unease never fully disappeared. The Price family, meanwhile, had to learn to live with a form of loss without closure, no real funeral, no goodbye, and no certainty to end the pain, only an archived file representing all the unanswered questions. Within law enforcement, the Richard Price case became a quiet example of the limits of investigation in that era, a file that officers mentioned with regret rather than pride, as it reminded them that not every effort leads to results, and that sometimes the truth lies beyond the reach of available tools and methods. Classifying the case as a cold case was not an act of complete surrender, but an acknowledgement that at that moment, the system had done everything within its power, even if the outcome did not meet the expectations of the family or society. Justice in this state was not erased but suspended, existing as a remote possibility, tied to the hope that one day, if new information, new technology, or someone speaking up emerged, that file could be pulled from storage and re-examined. But at the time the case officially became a cold case, all those possibilities remained theoretical, and the only reality the Price family and community had to face was the prolonged silence. Where Richard Price's story ended not with an answer, but with a legal and moral void, where justice had not been served, but also not abandoned, only left hanging between past and future, awaiting something no one knew would ever come. As the file on Richard Price was placed in storage, and the case sank into legal silence, in a place far from Georgia, a completely separate story began to form that no one, at that time, could connect to the disappearance of the 9-year-old boy in Macon. In a small coastal community in Florida, a child appeared with a new name, one not tied to any memories or public records, and was introduced as if he had always belonged there. The boy's appearance did not draw special attention, as the 1950s were still a time when moving between states, especially under vague family circumstances, was not always documented or closely scrutinized, and local communities tended to accept simple explanations rather than ask questions. This new location was vastly different from Macon, in both geography and pace of life, with unfamiliar streets, unfamiliar neighborhoods, and an environment where no one knew where the boy had come from, and that very unfamiliarity became the perfect shield for an incomplete identity. The boy lived in a family without full legal clarity of origin, or at least without the paperwork typically expected for a child his age. No clear birth certificate, no complete medical records, and no traceable past that could be easily verified. In that era's context, the absence of personal records was not overly unusual for families on the margins of the administrative system, and thus it was not enough to trigger any official inquiry from authorities. No one seriously probed the boy's past, not because people weren't curious, but because that curiosity was quickly soothed by short surface-level reasonable answers, that he came from elsewhere, that family circumstances were complicated, that it was best not to dig deeper. Those around him, from neighbors to teachers and community members, gradually grew accustomed to the boy's presence as an obvious fact, and over time, questions about his origins were no longer raised, replaced by everyday concerns and new stories. For the boy himself, the new identity was not a choice but an imposed reality, a name repeated until it became reflex, a new life built on the foundation of things left unsaid. He learned to adapt to his surroundings by observing and imitating, accepting the unspoken rules of the family and community, without the chance to compare them to anything else, as memories of his previous life, if they lingered, were faint and fragmented, not clear enough to form questions. The silence enveloping his past came not only from those around him, but was also maintained by the boy himself, as he gradually learned that not asking and not speaking was the safest way to exist in an environment where everything depended on others' acceptance. Over time, that silence became the default state, where the past was neither mentioned, recorded, nor verified, creating a large void in his life story that no one tried to fill. While in Georgia, the Richard Price file lay dormant in storage as evidence of an unsolved case. In Florida, the life of the boy, with the new identity, continued without any sign that the two stories were related. There were no lines of communication, no official reports, and no clear overlaps to connect a missing child in Macon with a child appearing elsewhere, and that very absence allowed the two realities to exist side by side, without intersecting. The prolonged silence over the years not only concealed the boy's true origins, but also created a fragile yet effective layer of protection, where questions about identity were indefinitely postponed, and any chance of discovery was pushed back by the system's lack of interest and the community's passive acceptance. In that context, the boy grew up not with the awareness that he was carrying a secret, but with a vague feeling that something was incomplete in his own story, a feeling not clear enough to name, but strong enough to form an unconscious wariness whenever someone asked about the past. That very wariness, combined with no one truly probing deeper, helped maintain the fragile balance of the new life, where everything continued based on the assumption that the past didn't matter, that the present was enough, and that some stories were best left undisturbed in silence, a silence that at the time no one considered unusual, but which later, in retrospect, would become the key to understanding how a child could disappear in Georgia, while simultaneously existing elsewhere under a completely different identity. The silence surrounding the boy's origins in Florida was not just a gap in the records. It gradually became the foundation for an entire childhood that existed outside the official framework society typically uses to validate a person's existence. He grew up in an environment where everything operated based on tacit agreements rather than paperwork, where going to school, seeing a doctor, or participating in community activities were all handled in flexible ways, without heavy emphasis on proving who he was or where he came from. In the 1950s and early 1960s, especially in coastal or suburban communities in Florida, not every child had complete records, and so his existence outside the administrative system did not immediately raise suspicion, but was accepted as part of a social reality still full of loopholes. That very lack of oversight allowed his new identity to continue unchallenged, but it also placed him in a precarious state, where the right to protection and recognition depended entirely on those around him. In the young boy's mind, the concept of biological family barely existed, not because he tried to forget, but because there were not enough clear memories to hold on to. Any faint images that did exist drifted by like disconnected fragments that never formed a story. He did not remember his parents' names, the first house, or the town where he was born, and if there was any sense of loss, it only appeared as a nameless emptiness, a feeling that something had been missing from the start, but was not specific enough to turn into questions. This absence of memory was both a consequence of time and the result of an environment where the past was never mentioned, where there were no family stories told in the evenings, no old photos to evoke remembrance, and no one actively bringing up what had been left behind. The lack of original documents became a quiet but persistent reality in his life, affecting aspects that a normal child rarely had to think about, from formal school registration to accessing health services, all handled through temporary, flexible, and sometimes makeshift means. The adults around him might offer brief explanations: papers got lost, family circumstances were complicated, everything would be fine eventually, and he learned to accept those answers without asking more, because asking too much seemed to bring no benefit in an environment where his existence depended on not causing trouble. The family relationships he experienced were therefore not clear in the conventional sense, with no sharp boundaries between caregivers, guardians, and relatives, only connections based on presence and authority, where affection, if it existed, always came with reservation. He did not know exactly what to call the people around him in his heart, because their roles were not clearly defined, and that ambiguity taught him to observe rather than attach, to listen rather than express, a survival strategy suited to the circumstances, but one that also shaped a reserved personality from very early on. In that environment, adaptation was not a natural process that unfolded over time, but a forced one, where he had to learn to blend in quickly to avoid attention, to not become a question needing an answer. He learned to speak and behave like the other children, to hide confusion whenever someone asked about his past, and to stay silent when no answer was available, because silence was often more easily accepted than an incomplete story. School, instead of becoming a place of stability, was a space where he constantly had to adjust himself, both to meet the expectations of teachers and peers, and to avoid situations that might lead to deeper probing about his family and origins. In rare private moments, he could sense an invisible difference between himself and the other children, a distance not stemming from behavior or ability, but from lacking a clear foundation to rely on, a complete life story to tell. However, that difference was rarely named, because he had neither the words nor the frame of reference to express it, and so it existed as a background feeling, influencing how he viewed himself and the world without ever being brought to light. Over the years, the new identity gradually became familiar, not because it reflected his true self, but because it was the only one recognized and repeated, and that very repetition created a false sense of stability, where the present completely covered the past. His childhood was therefore not a series of memories tied to safety and belonging, but a process of learning to exist in the gray area between acceptance and being overlooked, where he was both part of the community and always on its edge. This forced adaptation did not leave obvious wounds immediately, but it quietly shaped how he responded to the world, how he built relationships, and how he faced questions about himself, creating a complex psychological foundation that at the time, no one recognized as abnormal. While the Richard Price file remained dormant in Georgia like an unresolved story, the boy's childhood under a different identity continued in Florida, not fully documented, not connected to the past, and not placed in any official context, existing as living proof of how a person could grow up outside the system, carrying an invisible void that even they did not know how to name, but that would follow them for the rest of their life. The forced adaptation in his early years did not completely erase the psychological aftershocks the boy carried, but only pushed them deeper, where they began to manifest as hard-to-name signs of instability as he grew older. Recurring nightmares appeared very early, not with a clear script but as fragmented sensations, broken images that never formed a story, where he would often wake up in a state of panic without being able to explain why his heart was racing, or why the fear lingered even after opening his eyes. In those dreams there were no familiar faces or specific places, only the feeling of being separated from something important, a vague but persistent loss, as if part of his life had been left somewhere he could not return to. During the day, these nightmares did not vanish entirely, but left echoes in how he reacted to the world around him, when seemingly harmless situations triggered abnormal psychological responses, excessive alertness to sudden changes, an avoidance reflex when adults got too close, or unexplained tension whenever he had to leave a familiar space. These reactions were not clear enough to be seen as signs of a specific problem, but they repeated enough to form a pattern that even he gradually noticed, that he responded differently from the children around him. Unconscious fear seeped into the most ordinary moments, not erupting into panic, but existing as a silent underlying layer that governed behavior, causing him to always maintain a certain distance from others, to observe before trusting, and to always be prepared for the possibility that everything could disappear at any moment. He did not know what he was afraid of, because there were no specific memories to attach the fear to, but the unease still arose whenever facing separation, even temporary, like staying in a new place, meeting strangers, or entering situations he could not fully control. His memories, when looked back on, did not develop in a continuous flow like those of other children, but existed as scattered fragments, images of unclear origin, sometimes a sound, a scent, or a feeling inexplicably familiar, that appeared and vanished without leaving clues. These memory fragments were not specific enough to form a story, but they were strong enough to make him feel he had once been somewhere else, belonged to a different context, though he could not pinpoint where or when. Whenever he tried to focus on those sensations, they slipped out of reach, as if his brain both wanted to remember and hide something at the same time, creating an internal conflict he had no tools to resolve. No one around him was close enough or attentive enough to recognize that these manifestations might be signs of deeper trauma, because on the surface he still blended in, studied, and lived like any other child, and in that social context, children's psychological difficulties were rarely identified or seriously discussed. When asked about the nightmares or moments of unfounded fear, he often did not know how to answer, because he himself did not understand their source, and the lack of explanation made it easy for the adults around him to dismiss them as temporary phases that would fade with time. Yet instead of fading, these signs of instability changed form as he grew older, becoming more subtle and harder to detect, shifting from impulsive reactions to stable behavioral patterns, like a tendency to keep emotions private, avoid mentioning the past, and not ask about what was left unsaid. He learned to live with the ambiguity by not touching it, treating the gaps in memory and emotion as an inseparable part of himself, even though he did not understand why they existed. In the rare moments when he allowed himself to think about the origin of these feelings, he found no answers, only a silent void, with no clear memories to compare, no family story to hold on to, and no one to confirm or deny the vague doubts forming. The inability to explain the source of these signs of instability led him to gradually accept that they were simply part of who he was, something innate or random, rather than the result of a specific event, and this acceptance helped him continue living without being paralyzed by unanswered questions. However, beneath the surface of that adaptation, the nightmares, unconscious fears, and fragmented memories persisted as silent signals of an unnamed past, signs that something had happened very early, leaving an imprint that time and silence could not completely erase. Meanwhile, the file on Richard Price remained dormant in the archives in Georgia, unconnected to the life unfolding in Florida, and this absolute separation allowed the signs of instability in the boy to grow without being placed in their proper context, becoming a closed inner story, existing parallel to a case the system had left behind, where questions about the origin of the fear and fragmented memories had yet to be seriously asked. The signs of instability that had appeared quietly in childhood did not disappear as the boy entered adulthood, they merely changed form, blending into his efforts to build a normal life in the way society expected. As he grew older, he participated in education and work like those around him, trying to meet basic standards to survive and avoid attention, because work, even when not always stable or aligned with personal desires, still gave him the necessary sense that he was standing on his own 2 feet. Learning was not tied to ambition or long-term direction, but was clearly pragmatic, enough to open labor opportunities, and enough to avoid questions about background or origins that he always wanted to evade. In the workplace, he was seen as quiet, hard-working, and rarely sharing personal matters, an image that allowed him to fit in without having to explain too much about himself. Over time, he gradually established a new family, not as a repetition of a traditional family model he had never truly experienced, but as an effort to create an anchor for his life, a structure that provided the stability he had always lacked. Family relationships were built on the present and future, steering clear of the past, because the past for him was not only vague, but carried an unnamed unease. He became a partner and a father with a strong sense of responsibility, partly driven by a desire not to let the voids he had carried repeat in the next generation, even though he could not clearly identify the source of that urge. However, in the very process of building a new family, avoiding the past became a clear life strategy. When he rarely mentioned childhood, avoided telling stories about his original family, and skillfully redirected whenever someone was curious about his early years. Questions about birthplace, biological parents, or personal history were often answered with vague generalities, enough to satisfy social courtesy, but not opening the door to deeper conversations. This avoidance was not entirely the result of a conscious decision, but a reflex formed over years of living in silence, where not speaking meant avoiding risk and maintaining a fragile balance. His identity therefore remained vague even in adulthood, not because he lacked a name or a specific life, but because the foundational elements that typically shape personal identity were missing or unverifiable. He existed as a legal person in society, working, contributing and building a family, but deep inside, there was always the feeling that he was living based on an incomplete story, one whose beginning had been lost long ago. This lingering sense of displacement did not manifest as an overt crisis, but existed as a background state, a feeling of alienation even in the most seemingly familiar moments, like family gatherings, hearing others talk about ancestors, or facing questions about origins. He could be physically and emotionally present but always held back an invisible distance, as if part of himself could never fully merge into any community or story. Over time, that displacement became familiar, accepted as a personal trait rather than a problem to solve, and this acceptance helped him continue living without being drawn into questions that might disrupt his current life. However, in rare quiet moments, the vague sense of identity resurfaced, especially when he looked at his own children and realized they had a history, a clear family flow that he could not provide for himself. This contrast did not lead to any specific action, but it deepened the awareness that his life was built on a rootless foundation, where the present had to bear the full weight of an empty past. While the surrounding society continued to operate in familiar cycles and the Richard Price file remained dormant in the Georgia archives, like a story closed legally, the adult life of that former boy continued in a parallel state, where a person existed fully in function, but not completely in identity. Maturity did not bring answers to the smoldering questions from childhood, but only provided new layers of roles to cover them, from worker to husband to father, and those very roles both helped him integrate into society and prolonged the lingering displacement, a state not intense enough to shatter the life he had built, but persistent enough to remind him that something important was still missing, a part of his life story he had never been given the chance to know. While the life of the boy living under a different identity continued to drift in prolonged ambiguity, in Georgia, the Price family also entered a different phase of their grief, one no longer marked by searches or investigations, but by the quiet passage of time and the inevitable aging of those left behind. Richard's parents, who had lived in a state of tense waiting during the early years after their son's disappearance, gradually had to face the reality that the system had closed their case, and though they never truly abandoned hope in their hearts, life still forced them to carry on in whatever way their bodies and circumstances allowed. The passing years left their marks in very ordinary ways: hair gradually turning gray, health declining, daily habits changing, but beneath all those changes, the loss of Richard remained like an unhealed wound, no longer bleeding, but never disappearing. Within the family, Richard slowly shifted from a child mentioned every day to a memory invoked more cautiously, not because affection had faded, but because each mention brought unresolved pain, and silence sometimes became the only way to keep life moving forward. The items that once belonged to Richard, clothes, toys, the small objects tied to his childhood, were stored away like relics, neither reused nor discarded, existing in the home, as silent reminders of a presence that was gone. Over time, other relatives in the Price family also aged, some passing away without ever knowing what truly happened to Richard, carrying unanswered questions with them, and each time that happened, the pain was not only relived but passed on, as the next generation inherited memories of Richard, not through direct experience, but through retold stories, the silences during family meals, and the averted glances whenever his name was mentioned. In that context, Richard gradually became a collective memory in the family, a symbol of loss more than a specific person with an unfinished future, and this very transformation both helped the family survive and deepened the sense that Richard had been frozen in time, forever the 9-year-old boy from 1955. To cope with that suspended state, the Price family had to perform symbolic rituals to partially close the grief, including a memorial service with no body and no confirmed evidence of death, but necessary so the family and community could have an official space to express their mourning. That service did not mark the end of hope, but rather an acknowledgement that the lives of those left behind could not remain forever suspended in waiting, and that they needed a form of remembrance to keep Richard in their memory, in a less painful way. However, holding a symbolic funeral also carried a sense of betrayal toward the deep belief that Richard might still be alive somewhere, an inner conflict that left many family members never fully comfortable with the decision. The pain therefore did not vanish, but changed form, becoming smoldering and more enduring, spreading across generations like an unfinished story passed down, where each person received it in their own way, but all carried the sense of a loss without closure. For the later generations, those who never met Richard, that pain existed as a gap in the family history, a uncle, brother or son mentioned but without personal memories to connect to, creating an indirect yet profound link to a tragedy that had shaped the family long before they were born. The transmission of pain across generations did not happen through complaints, but through behaviors and attitudes, excessive caution, fear of loss, and a feeling that safety was never a given, factors that influenced how the Price family viewed the world and raised their children and grandchildren. Over time, a reluctant acceptance gradually formed, not as letting go, but as a compromise with the reality that not every story has an answer, and that continuing to live did not mean forgetting. Richard's parents, in their final years, carried both hope and despair, continually wondering if one day the truth would be revealed, but also understanding that the chance of witnessing it was growing ever more remote. Their acceptance was not loud or decisive, but quiet, in the way they stopped asking questions of the police, in no longer following news of other missing persons cases with the same level of expectation, and in learning to live with the memory of Richard as an inseparable part of the family. For the Price family, the cold case was not just a legal status, but a living condition that lasted decades, where the pain was contained in memory, passed from one person to another, and finally accepted as an unchangeable reality. While life went on and the world around them changed, Richard remained in the family as an absent presence, a name tied to both love and loss, and that reluctant acceptance, though never complete, became the only way for the Price family to continue existing in the shadow of a story that was never closed. The Price family's reluctant acceptance and the prolonged silence of the investigative system did not mean that every trace related to Richard's disappearance had completely vanished, only that they had been pushed out of focus, scattered in dusty old files and fading memories, waiting for another moment to be revisited. In the process of closing and archiving the case, some reports compiled in the early days of the investigation did not receive the necessary attention, not because they were worthless, but because they did not fit the hypotheses being prioritized at the time. These reports, often brief notes about unclear observations or details that could not be immediately verified, were quickly relegated to secondary information, overshadowed by the pressure to pursue leads that seemed more concrete and easier to check. In a context lacking supporting technology, and with time eroded by the initial urgency, choosing to focus on certain investigative directions meant leaving other information behind, not because it was wrong, but because it did not yield immediate results. Alongside the little-noticed reports were statements that had not been fully verified, stories told by witnesses in states of stress, sometimes contradicting each other, or known facts, causing them to be deemed unreliable. In the early days, police had to make quick decisions about which statements to believe and which to disregard, and in that process, some information may have been dismissed, simply because it did not fit the emerging investigative picture. The passage of time further diminished the direct value of these statements as witnesses' memories changed, and there was no way to return to the original moment for accurate re-verification. Storage errors became another key factor in obscuring potential leads, as files were organized according to the standards of that era, lacking systematization and cross-referencing capabilities, making it nearly impossible to connect scattered information. Some documents were misclassified, others lacked dates or signatures, and some investigators' personal notes were never integrated into the official file, creating gaps that later became very hard to fill. These errors did not stem from individual negligence, but reflected the limitations of a system not designed to handle cases lasting decades, where storage primarily served administrative purposes rather than future re-investigation. For many years, those overlooked leads existed as details no one mentioned, unknown to the Price family, and unnoticed by the wider community, as the case had been labeled a cold case, and gradually slipped from collective memory. However, the value of this information lay not in its immediate impact in the past, but in its potential for re-evaluation when the context changed, when new questions were asked, and new tools allowed old data to be viewed in a different light. If in the initial investigation phase, an unclear report could be seen as unreliable, when placed alongside other facts, it might become a crucial piece in reconstructing a lost part of the picture. It was this shift in perspective that highlighted the potential of once overlooked leads, not as standalone evidence, but as suggestive signs for new investigative directions. Revisiting past storage errors and prioritization decisions also brought a deeper understanding of how the investigation had been shaped by the circumstances of the era, by societal pressures, and by technical limitations that could not be overcome at the time. The investigators of the past could not know that one day, new analytical methods would allow seemingly meaningless details to be linked together, and so their overlooking of certain leads was not personal failure, but a consequence of a system not yet ready for questions spanning decades. In retrospect, the forgotten reports, unverified statements, and storage errors were no longer mere mistakes, but historical data reflecting how truth could be obscured, not by malice, but by human and technological limitations. From this viewpoint, the possibility of reopening Richard Price's case file was no longer a far-fetched idea, but a latent potential, depending on whether someone was willing to dig deep into the overlooked details and place them in a new context. Those old leads, though weak and incomplete, could become the foundation for a review if combined with modern analytical methods and an approach unbound by old hypotheses. While for the Price family, these leads were never fully known, for the investigative system they existed as a reminder that not all answers were lost, they might simply be lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. The existence of overlooked leads thus carried a dual meaning, both evidence of the initial investigation's limitations and a slender source of hope that Richard's story was not entirely closed, that in those dusty old files, there might still be details capable of changing the view of the case, if re-examined with patience and the right tools. In that state, the Richard Price case continued to exist as a cold case, not only due to a lack of new evidence, but because the old evidence had never been fully exploited, and this very realization quietly opened the possibility that one day, if someone returned to those overlooked leads with a fresh perspective, a file thought to be dormant could be reconnected, not by creating new data, but by re-understanding what had once been dismissed. The possibility of reopening Richard Price's case file, though still vague from the system's perspective, ran parallel to another quiet shift in the life of the man who had grown up under the substitute identity. As scattered fragments of the past began colliding with the present in ways no longer easy to ignore, the inconsistencies in his personal records did not appear as a sudden discovery, but emerged gradually through everyday procedures, administrative forms, seemingly harmless questions that exposed a lack of consistency in basic information such as place of birth, date of birth, and details related to his early years. There were times he noticed that different documents recorded facts that did not fully match, small discrepancies enough to be overlooked for most of his life, but when placed side by side, they formed an unstable picture, as if the foundation of his identity had been built from pieces of information not originating from the same source. These mismatched details were initially explained by familiar reasons: lost records, inaccurate past documentation, complex family circumstances leading to unavoidable omissions, and for many years, those explanations were sufficient to quell any doubts. However, as time passed and the small inconsistencies continued to surface in various contexts, from education and employment to legal procedures involving his own family, they began to accumulate into a feeling that could no longer be dismissed, that these were not just random administrative errors, details that seemed trivial, a mismatched birth date, an unverifiable location, a period with no recorded history, gradually formed a larger void in his life story, causing questions long avoided to resurface. The question of origins did not arise as fleeting curiosity, but as an increasingly clear need to understand himself, especially as he looked back on his journey and realized he had lived most of his life based on a story he had never verified. The fragmented childhood memories, once seen as incomprehensible feelings unrelated to anything, were now placed in a new context, where they might be signs of a hidden past, rather than products of imagination or personal sensitivity. The urge to seek the truth did not stem from a specific event, but from a maturing awareness, as he realized that continuing to avoid the past no longer provided the security it once had. In fact, it was creating growing psychological pressure that affected how he viewed himself and his relationships with those around him. In family conversations, he began to notice his own awkwardness whenever the topic touched on ancestry, family history, or traits said to be passed through blood, and that awkwardness was no longer as easy to hide as before. Those closest to him, though not asking directly, also sensed the gap in his story, and the very presence of that gap made him wonder whether not knowing where he came from was inadvertently creating an invisible boundary between him and the people he loved. The sense of disconnection, once accepted as part of his personality, was now re-examined as a potentially explainable consequence, if only he could find its true source, and that thought brought both hope and fear that the truth might disrupt the life he had carefully built. The decision to confront the identity doubts did not come in a decisive moment, but formed through repeated weighing of options, as he asked himself whether knowing the truth was worth more than maintaining current stability. Each time he considered verifying his origins, he was pulled between two poles, the need to know who he really was on one side, and the fear that the truth, if it existed, might bring unforeseen consequences, not just for himself, but for the family he had built on the other. However, the prolonged existence of record inconsistencies, and the increasingly evident unease, made the choice to remain silent harder, because silence was no longer a safe zone but the source of tension. Deciding to verify his identity thus became a deeply personal step, not aimed at seeking a sensational story or dramatically changing his life, but simply to close a circle that had been open for so long without ever being sealed. He began considering accessible options, from gathering old documents and cross-checking information, to contemplating verification methods he had never thought of before, not hastily, but with the caution of someone who understood that each step could lead to irreversible discoveries. This decision was not widely shared or announced as a major milestone. It unfolded in silence, fitting the way he had lived most of his life, but different in that this time, silence was not for avoidance, but for preparation to face the truth. In the moment of making that decision, he could not know that the doubts forming might connect to a story buried in Georgia for decades, because for him, this was simply a journey of self-discovery, a belated but necessary effort to resolve questions that had smoldered since childhood. However, the very act of choosing to verify, though driven by personal motives, marked the first time he actively challenged the identity story imposed on him, opening the possibility that the record inconsistencies and mismatched details were not random errors, but signs of a larger truth, waiting to be clarified, a truth he did not yet know, but was ready to face, no matter where it led him. The decision to verify his identity, stemming from personal doubts that had accumulated over many years, ultimately led him to a method that had previously existed only as a distant concept: genealogy DNA testing, a modern tool promising to answer questions that paperwork and memories could not resolve. Initially, accessing the DNA test did not resemble a large-scale investigation, but rather a cautious experimental step, a private effort to seek clues about his biological origins without having to directly confront those around him. He collected the sample according to the instructions, sent it off with a mindset of both hope and reservation, because deep down, he wasn't sure what he was looking for. He only knew that the prolonged ambiguity had reached a point where it needed to be confronted with an objective fact. The waiting period for the results became a phase of silent tension, where different scenarios continuously played out in his mind, from the possibility of finding no connections at all to the prospect of discovering relationships he had never imagined, and it was precisely that uncertainty that made each passing day carry an indescribable sense of anticipation. When the results finally arrived, they did not provide a simple answer, but instead revealed a series of unexpected information, genetic connections that did not match any of the family stories he had ever been told. The indicators pointed to the existence of close blood relationships, matches that could not be explained by hypotheses of adoption or ordinary record errors, and it was the cold clarity of the scientific data that shattered every attempt to reassure himself that the previous contradictions were merely coincidental. The names that appeared in the analysis results were unfamiliar, but when cross-referenced with public data sources, they began to sketch a path leading to Georgia, a location he had never associated with his life through any memory or story. The connection to the Price family did not emerge immediately as a clear conclusion, but gradually formed through comparing match levels, through distant and close relatives identified by genetic probabilities, and through recognizing that these pieces converged around a family with a history of child disappearances from the mid-20th century. When the name Price surfaced as a scientifically grounded possibility, it was not just new information, but a shock to the entire structure of identity he had relied on to live for decades. The identity crisis did not unfold as a sudden panic, but as a slow collapse, where each layer of certainty was peeled away, revealing a void far deeper than the initial doubts. He was forced to revisit his entire life in the light of the possibility that he was not the person he had believed himself to be, that the gaps in memory, the record contradictions, and the prolonged feelings of displacement were not random flaws, but traces of a truth concealed since childhood. Confronting the DNA results not only raised questions about biological origins, but also shook current relationships, as he had to wonder whether his role in the family he had built would change, and whether pursuing the truth would hurt the loved ones who had shared a life with him based on a different story. The internal conflict became more pronounced when he realized that the DNA data could not be denied or negotiated. It existed as an objective truth, forcing him to choose between accepting a life based on false assumptions or facing an entirely new past. In the process of trying to understand those results, he began gathering more information, not as an investigator, but as someone trying to piece together his life story from scattered data fragments. Learning about the Price family, about the disappearance of a 9-year-old boy in Georgia in 1955, and about how that case had become a cold case gradually created a frightening overlap with the gaps in his own life, from the time he appeared in Florida to the complete absence of any records before that. The feeling that two seemingly unrelated stories might actually be one became increasingly hard to ignore, and it was this intersection that pushed him into a state of both fear and fascination, where the truth, though not yet fully confirmed, was present enough to make turning away impossible. Clarifying the truth became an unavoidable need, no longer a question of whether he wanted to know, but whether he could continue living without knowing. When the scientific evidence had opened a door that once looked through, could not be pretended away. However, this process did not unfold in excitement or anticipation, but in a cautious mindset, as he understood that each next step could have profound consequences, not only for himself, but also for others, especially those who might be directly related to the name Price. The identity crisis was thus not just personal confusion, but a prolonged state, where he tried to maintain his current life, while quietly preparing mentally for the possibility that its entire foundation might need to be rewritten. The DNA data, with its objective and emotionless nature, had become an irreversible turning point, shifting the search journey from the internal realm to a process of clarifying a truth capable of extending beyond personal life, though at that time, he could not yet imagine the depth of what was about to be revealed. In a state of suspension between an unconfirmed past and a present not yet ready for change, he stood at a crossroads where the truth, though still incomplete, was powerful enough to challenge every old assumption, and from that moment, the journey to verify identity was no longer just about resolving personal doubts, but had become a step capable of reconnecting stories, separated for more than half a century, opening the door to illuminating a truth that both he and the Price family had never been given the chance to know. The turning point from the DNA data, which began as a personal journey to resolve an identity crisis, quickly extended beyond the private sphere when the genetic match results were clear enough to attract the attention of modern investigative agencies, units accustomed to handling cold cases with methods and technology that did not exist in 1955. When the initial information was forwarded to the relevant authorities in Georgia, the disappearance of Richard Price, which had lain dormant in archives for decades, was pulled out of hibernation and placed back on the desks of specialized investigators, not because of a new lead at the scene, but because of a chain of biological data challenging the old legal conclusions. The case reopening process followed modern standards, with the formation of a small team focused on assessing the credibility of the DNA information, determining whether the results provided sufficient grounds to officially reconsider the case, and from the very first steps, the differences between 21st century investigation and the original one became evident. The old files were retrieved from storage, each document, report, and statement digitized, reorganized, and reviewed with a new objective, not to search for traces of an ongoing incident, but to determine whether what had been recorded could connect to current data. This review process aimed not only to identify errors, but also to understand the context and logic of the investigative decisions made in 1955, when investigators then worked under resource shortages and faced social pressures far different from today. Reports once downplayed, statements not fully verified, and details overlooked were re-examined, this time with the support of interconnected databases and modern analysis methods, allowing cross-verification in ways previously impossible. Parallel to reviewing the old files, the new data from genealogy DNA testing was thoroughly analyzed to determine match levels, the scope of blood relationships, and the ability to rule out alternative hypotheses, a highly scientific process to ensure that reopening the case was based not on speculation or emotion, but on verifiable evidence. Cross-referencing new and old data gradually revealed notable intersections, not as a single clue but as a chain of compatibilities in time, location and circumstances, from the moment Richard Price disappeared to the appearance of a child of unknown origin in Florida during the same period. These coincidences, when placed alongside the DNA results, formed a hypothesis framework strong enough to justify continuing the investigation, not as a hasty reversal of old conclusions, but as a re-verification based on new evidence. During this phase, investigators also began locating and interviewing surviving witnesses, a task both necessary and challenging, as most people directly involved in the 1955 case had passed away or were no longer capable of providing clear statements. Any remaining witnesses carried memories eroded by time, and approaching them required caution to avoid imposing modern conclusions on faded past experiences. The interviews focused on reconfirming basic details, not seeking confessions or sensational information, but checking consistency between remaining memories and recorded facts, a step more about authentication than discovery. In this process, the differences between personal memory and official documents became evident, emphasizing that reopening the case was not a quest for a complete narrative, but a process of piecing together uneven information into the most grounded picture possible. For the man who had initiated the DNA test, the involvement of modern investigative agencies brought a feeling of both relief and tension, as his personal journey had now become part of an official process where every piece of information he provided was examined from legal and scientific perspectives. Investigators approached him not as a suspect or ordinary witness, but as an individual potentially directly related to a historical case, and every verification step was conducted with care to avoid unnecessary harm to the life he had built. Identity confirmation did not happen in a single step, but through multiple layers of checks, from comparing DNA results with living Price family members, to matching timelines and biological data, to rule out random coincidence. Each verification step clarified the degree of connection between him and the Price family, while gradually narrowing alternative hypotheses, until the overall picture no longer contained major contradictions. When identity confirmation reached a sufficiently certain threshold, it was not announced hastily, but handled as an investigative conclusion, requiring approval and consensus from multiple levels, reflecting the caution of the modern system when facing cases with profound impacts on personal and community lives. For the Price family, initial information about the case, reopening and possible identity clarification brought a complex emotional state, where hope and skepticism coexisted, as after decades of reluctant acceptance, facing the possibility that Richard might still be alive raised questions they never thought they would have to answer. In that context, identity confirmation was not just an investigative step, but a psychological preparation process for all involved, as the truth, though relieving, could also disrupt long-established balances. When investigators completed necessary cross-checks and reached a conclusion with sufficient scientific and legal grounds, reopening the Richard Price case was no longer a vague possibility, but an officially recorded reality, marking the first time in decades that the case was re-examined with the full tools of the modern era. However, at the time of identity confirmation, the process's focus remained on clarifying the truth about the person and origins, not yet on conclusions about responsibility or motive, reflecting the cautious approach of a system that understands reconnecting a story broken for more than half a century requires not only evidence, but also patience and respect for the human consequences of that truth. When Richard Price's identity was confirmed through modern scientific methods, the investigation's focus could not stop at answering who the boy had been, but had to turn back the clock to 1955 to confront the far more difficult question: what really happened on the day Richard disappeared, and how a 9-year-old child could be taken out of Georgia without leaving traces clear enough for the system of that time to detect. Investigators began piecing together all the 1955 data, not in a simple linear sequence, but by placing each old piece of information into a new analytical framework, where hypotheses were no longer limited by initial biases or time pressures. Scene reports, witness statements, descriptions of Richard's last known route, and details about strangers in the area at that time were re-examined with the goal of uncovering the hidden logic behind the disappearance, rather than just identifying what had been missed. Reconstructing the social context of Georgia in 1955 played a key role in this process, as it was a period when interstate travel controls were lax, child protection mechanisms were underdeveloped, and community-based trust meant many unusual behaviors were not immediately suspected. Based on clarified facts about Richard appearing in Florida within a relatively short time after the disappearance, investigators focused on evaluating final hypotheses centered on intentional abduction, gradually ruling out possibilities once considered, such as accident or prolonged wandering. The hypothesis of a lone individual behind the incident was weighed against one involving some form of organization or informal network, such as child brokers, illegal adoptions, or shadowy relationships existing on the fringes of the legal system at that time. This analysis aimed not to find a sensational answer, but to determine which scenario best fit what could be observed from historical data and modern investigative results. In the lone individual hypothesis, scenarios often revolved around someone with access to Richard, the ability to travel between states, and a motive strong enough to keep the matter secret for a long time, a possibility that could not be ruled out, but was also hard to prove when most potentially involved people might have passed away. Conversely, the network hypothesis, though lacking direct evidence that Richard was a victim of an organized ring, explained certain factors like the boy's quick acquisition of a new identity, the absence of original records, and the lack of inquiries into his past for many years. As in that context, informal transactions could occur under the guise of help or spontaneous adoption. However, delving deeper into the analysis, investigators had to acknowledge that both hypotheses contained serious evidential gaps that could not be filled solely by inference or indirect data. There were no living direct witnesses to confirm abduction, no official documents recording child transfer, and no physical evidence linking a specific individual or group to taking Richard out of Georgia. These gaps were not just consequences of time, but also reflections of the 1955 investigative system's limitations, where information recording and storage were not designed to withstand scrutiny decades later. Modern investigators, despite advanced technology and methods, also had to face the reality that some questions could not be fully answered because the necessary data simply no longer existed. Re-evaluating the entire file thus did not lead to a definitive conclusion about the perpetrator's identity, but toward determining prosecution limits in the current legal context, where statutes of limitations, the passing of potentially involved people, and lack of direct evidence created insurmountable barriers. Prosecutors involved in this process had to balance the desire for symbolic justice with the responsibility not to make unprovable accusations in court, a difficult but necessary balance to protect the legal system's integrity. Determining that prosecution was impossible did not mean denying the abduction or downplaying the pain it caused, but acknowledging that criminal justice has certain limits when facing cases eroded by time. In tracing back the abduction, investigators also realized that clarifying the truth lay not only in identifying a specific perpetrator, but also in understanding and recording systemic factors that allowed a child to disappear and live under a different identity for decades. The lack of interstate data links, lax child record management, and over-reliance on personal explanations in communities created an environment where wrongdoing could occur without timely detection. Viewed from this perspective, Richard Price's case was not just a personal tragedy, but also evidence of historical gaps in child protection systems, gaps that society only began recognizing and addressing decades later. At the end of the tracing phase, investigators reached a cautious consensus that although the victim's identity had been clarified and the broken story reconnected to some extent, precisely determining who abducted Richard and how might forever remain beyond legal proof. The truth illuminated here was not a complete indictment, but a complex picture where what is known and what cannot be known coexist, forcing all involved to accept that justice in this case would never take the familiar form of a trial or verdict, but exist as an official recognition that Richard Price was deprived of his childhood and identity, and that this loss, though not attributable to a specific individual, remains a wrongdoing that needs to be named. After the reverse investigation into the kidnapping reached cautious investigative conclusions, but could not establish specific individual responsibility, legal reality forced everyone involved to confront an unavoidable boundary: the limits of justice within the framework of the existing law. The expiration of the statute of limitations became the first and most obvious factor shaping this outcome, because under the regulations applicable at the time of the incident in 1955, offenses related to kidnapping, if they did not lead to confirmation of death within a certain period, were all subject to limitation periods that society at the time considered reasonable. Although those regulations have changed significantly in the decades since, especially for crimes involving children, they could not be applied retroactively, and thus regardless of the severity of the act or its lasting consequences, the door to formal criminal prosecution had effectively closed long ago. Running parallel to the statute of limitations issue was the very high likelihood that the perpetrator, or those directly involved in taking Richard out of Georgia, had passed away, a reality that made any effort to determine individual responsibility, whether nominal or symbolic, extremely fragile. The fact that key figures were no longer alive not only eliminated the possibility of confrontation and deeper investigation, but also deprived the justice system of its most important tool, the ability to hold an individual accountable before the law. In that context, legal justice and truth began to separate into two parallel but non-overlapping concepts, as the truth about Richard's identity, about the fact that he had survived and grown up under a different name, could be confirmed through scientific evidence and modern investigation, yet legal justice could not keep pace to deliver a corresponding judgment. This difference created an uncomfortable sense of suspension for everyone involved, because while one part of the story had been clarified, the rest remained beyond the reach of the law, serving as a reminder that the justice system is not always capable of addressing multi-generational trauma. For investigators and prosecutors, acknowledging that the investigation could not be completed in the traditional way was a difficult but necessary step, as continuing to pursue unprovable charges or cases beyond the statute of limitations would only erode the legitimacy of the system. The decision not to prosecute was not made as a denial of responsibility, but as a candid recognition of the structural limits of the law, when facing historical cases where time had blurred evidence, memories, and people. However, for the Price family and for Richard himself, the limits of legal justice did not mean denying the pain or legitimizing the wrongdoing that had occurred. It only reflected that criminal justice is not the only path to acknowledging and processing the truth. The truth, in this case, existed as a confirmed reality, independent of the ability to punish, and that very separation forced society to rethink the meaning of justice in cases that could no longer be closed with a verdict. The societal aftermath of the case, therefore, did not stop at the question of who did what, but extended to broader discussions about how the legal system once operated, about the gaps that allowed a child to disappear undetected for decades, and about collective responsibility in protecting the most vulnerable. As news spread that Richard was alive, and his identity confirmed, public reaction was not just relief or emotion, but also confusion over a story with no perpetrator brought to light, a story where traditional justice could not be enforced. Debates arose about whether society could accept such an outcome, and whether confirming the truth, even without prosecution, could be considered another form of justice, the justice of acknowledgement and historical recognition. In public forums and media, the case became a classic example of the difference between what the law can do and what society expects, emphasizing that system reform lies not only in changing laws, but also in understanding the long-term consequences of past legal decisions. For the Price family, the limits of justice carried a deeper personal meaning, as they had to accept that although the truth about Richard had been clarified, they would never see a trial or an official apology from those responsible, and that their pain could not be soothed by familiar legal mechanisms. Yet the acknowledged truth also brought a different kind of closure, where they no longer had to live with the question of whether Richard was dead but could face the more complex reality that he had lived another life, taken from them but not entirely lost. The societal aftermath of the case continued to linger in the way it changed perceptions of cold cases, the role of DNA technology, and the importance of preserving and protecting records, not just for prosecution but to maintain the possibility of seeking truth in the future. Richard Price's case became a reminder that justice does not always arrive on time, and when it arrives late, it may take a different, imperfect, but still necessary form. The limits of justice in this instance were not an absolute failure, but a reality that had to be acknowledged, so society could continue to learn and change, because only by accepting those limits could people seek other paths to recognize pain, honor truth, and prevent similar tragedies in the future. The limits of legal justice meant the case could not be closed with a verdict or a trial, but that very void opened up a different, slower, and heavier process, where the confirmed truth forced the people involved to confront one another directly in real life. The official confirmation of Richard Price's identity took place as a cold administrative procedure on paper, but for the man who had carried a different identity for most of his life, it was the moment when all inner defenses were no longer sufficient to shield him, as the name once lost was now reattached to him by the state's seal and the consensus of science. The name Richard Price was no longer an investigative hypothesis or an abstract possibility, but a legal identity, carrying with it history, lineage, and a tragedy he had never lived through but could not deny. Facing that confirmation, the initial feeling was not relief but a profound disorientation, because being recognized as Richard meant having to acknowledge that his entire previous life had unfolded under a prolonged mistake, even though it was not of his own making. The meeting with the surviving relatives of the Price family was arranged in a particularly cautious setting, where no one viewed it as a simple reunion, but as a collision between memory and reality, between the image of a 9-year-old child frozen in time and a man who had lived a full life. Those relatives carried stories about Richard passed down through generations, where the boy had become a symbol of loss, rather than a fully grown person, and thus preparing mentally to face a flesh-and-blood Richard, with his own voice, habits and life, was a challenge not easily overcome. The encounter took place in a subdued atmosphere, where emotion did not erupt into dramatic reactions, but manifested in long pauses, searching glances, and tentative gestures. Richard stood before them not as someone returning home, but as someone entering a new space, where every relationship had to be built from scratch, even though they shared blood. The Price family looked at him with a mixture of recognition and strangeness, trying to find familiar features on an aged face, traits that might recall his parents, who had passed away never knowing their son was alive. That reunion moment did not erase 70 years of separation, but made the temporal distance more tangible than ever, present in every missed story, every gathering he was absent from, and every memory he could only hear recounted. The hugs, if any, carried the natural hesitation of people aware that they could not pretend to have lived this life together, and that affection, even with a blood foundation, still needed time to form. The unbridgeable gap became most evident when conversation touched on Richard's parents, who had lived and died in a state of waiting and reluctant acceptance, leaving subsequent generations with pain that had never been fully resolved. For the Price family, the comfort that Richard was alive could not be separated from the grief that they had missed the chance to live with him for most of his life, and that this reunion came too late to heal the deepest wounds. For Richard, standing before his birth family did not bring the familiar sense of returning to one's roots, because the life he had built, the family he loved, and the roles he had assumed all belonged to a different journey that could not be erased or replaced. The reality after the initial emotions quickly surfaced, as both sides had to face the question of how to exist in this new relationship without causing further harm, in a context with no societal template or personal experience to reference. Subsequent conversations focused not only on filling in the past, but also on setting boundaries for the present, as Richard could not become the son or brother in the traditional sense, and the Price family could not demand that he abandon the life he had built to fit the image in their memories. The reunion therefore was not a complete closure, but the beginning of a state of living with the truth, where everyone had to learn to accept that some losses could not be compensated, but could still be acknowledged honestly. In that space, joy and sorrow coexisted, neither canceling the other, but creating a complex emotion, where knowing the truth did not make everything easier, but made it more real. This reunion did not restore the lost childhood, did not bring legal justice to its destination, and did not erase the decades of isolation on both sides, but it broke the silence that had lasted for decades, allowing the people involved to look directly at one another, without having to assume or imagine. It was in that imperfection that the reunion carried a meaning deeper than any perfect ending, because it acknowledged that although the past could not be rewritten, the present could still be built on the clarified truth, and that recognizing one another, even belatedly, still held value in restoring humanity to a story once frozen in files and memories. The reunion did not close the story but only revealed a more complex reality, where Richard Price had to learn to exist with two identities simultaneously in one person, neither of which could be erased, yet neither fully aligned with the man he had become. On one hand, Richard was the name tied to blood, to his birth family in Georgia, to a 9-year-old child who had disappeared and become the center of a multi-generational tragedy. On the other, he remained the man who had lived most of his life under a different identity, building a career, starting a family, being a husband, a father, and creating relationships that could not be denied or replaced. Reconciling these two identities did not happen naturally, as each carried different expectations, different questions, and sometimes directly conflicting emotions. When with the Price family, Richard clearly felt the weight of history and loss, a sense that his presence both comforted and reopened pain, while when returning to his everyday life, he could not simply set aside the truth that he had once been a child stolen from his birth family. The tension between these two worlds gradually manifested as delayed trauma, psychological reactions that did not appear during the reunion moment, but quietly formed as emotions settled and life returned to normal rhythm. Questions that seemed answered re-emerged in different forms, not who am I, but where do I belong, and do I have the right to keep the life I've built? Delayed trauma did not take the form of dramatic panic attacks, but showed through mental fatigue, sleepless nights, and the feeling of being pulled between moral duty to his birth family and emotional responsibility to his current one. Richard realized that rediscovering his origins not only opened a door to the past, but also shattered the coping mechanisms he had relied on for decades, forcing him to rebuild his self-understanding from the ground up. Life after the media spotlight further complicated this process, as his story quickly shifted from a personal journey to a subject of public interest, carrying expectations that oversimplified a reality that could not be simplified. Headlines emphasizing found or miraculous reunion did not reflect the depth of the losses and internal conflicts Richard faced daily, and that attention, though not malicious, still created pressure to perform a certain role in public. While many expected a complete and inspiring ending, Richard had to confront the reality that his life could not be framed in a perfectly resolved story, and that rejecting those expectations was sometimes as difficult as meeting them. His family, the people who had shared his life under the old identity, also had to adapt to a new reality, where the husband and father they knew now carried another history, another family, and another pain they had not directly experienced. Redefining family became a necessary but challenging process, not just for Richard, but for everyone involved, as the concept of family no longer fit neatly into blood or traditional roles, but expanded to include relationships built through time and choice. The Price family, after the reunion, also had to adjust how they viewed Richard, no longer just the missing boy or symbol of tragedy, but a grown man with his own life, his own decisions, and boundaries that needed respect. This process required patience and acceptance from both sides, as no one could demand that the other fill gaps that had existed too long, and affection could not be forced solely by biological truth. Richard gradually realized that redefining family did not mean choosing one side or the other, but accepting that he could belong to multiple emotional spaces at once, even if that did not bring completeness or comfort. In quiet moments, when media attention faded and initial meetings became memories, Richard faced a new kind of loneliness, not like the previous isolation, but the feeling of standing at the intersection of multiple stories, none of which was entirely his own. Yet it was in that state that he began to form a different view of himself, no longer based entirely on externally imposed identities, but on lived experience, and the choices that had shaped who he was now. Post-reunion did not bring instant healing, but opened a long phase of adjustment, where every day was a negotiation between past and present, between the newly clarified truth and life continuing to move forward. Family, in this context, was no longer a fixed structure, but a flexible network of relationships, sustained by respect, understanding, and acceptance of one another's limits. Although the delayed trauma and internal conflicts did not disappear entirely, facing them in the light of truth gave Richard a sense of agency he had never had before, as for the first time in his life he could name what he had lost and what he had without pretending one did not exist. Post-reunion, therefore, was not a peaceful conclusion, but a new state of living, where truth, complex and sometimes painful, became the foundation for Richard and those around him to continue life more honestly, accepting that a person can carry multiple identities, multiple families, and multiple wounds, while still having the right to exist fully in the present. Post-reunion did not bring a clear full stop, but left behind a prolonged silence, where questions that had never been answered returned with greater weight, forcing both individuals and society to confront things that could not be reduced to a simple conclusion. The first and most persistent question remained who the real perpetrator was, who took Richard Price out of Georgia in 1955, a question that lingered like a shadow over the entire story, even though the victim's identity had been clarified. Hypotheses raised during the reinvestigation, from the actions of a lone individual to the possible existence of informal child adoption or brokering networks, could not be proven conclusively due to lack of direct evidence, and because those potentially involved were no longer alive to be questioned. The inability to name the perpetrator was not a denial of the crime, but an acknowledgement that time, silence, and systemic gaps had combined to obscure individual responsibility, turning a specific wrongdoing into a historical void that could not be filled with ordinary legal tools. As a result, Richard Price's story did not exist as an isolated case, but reflected numerous similar unresolved cases where children disappeared in decades before protection and tracking systems were perfected, only to grow up under different identities without anyone questioning it. Those cases, scattered across the United States and many other countries, shared the common thread of enabling social circumstances, unchecked community trust, and lack of data connectivity, creating conditions for disappearances to go undetected in time and become irreversible. The fact that Richard was found after 70 years was therefore both exceptional and a reminder that behind every cold case, there might still be a living person unaware that they are the center of an unfinished story. In that picture, the role of DNA in cold case investigations emerged as a game changer, not by completely replacing traditional methods, but by opening another path to truth when familiar leads had run dry. Genetic genealogy testing not only helped confirm biological identity, but also shattered long-held assumptions about the possibility of searching after decades, proving that truth does not have to be buried with time if the right tools exist to trace it back. However, Richard's story also showed that DNA is not an all-powerful solution, because although it can confirm the victim, it cannot by itself identify the perpetrator, recreate motive, or replace lost evidence. This posed an important lesson for modern investigative systems, that technology, no matter how advanced, still needs to be placed within a careful ethical and legal framework, where the goal is not only to uncover truth, but also to protect the people affected by it. The systemic lessons drawn from this case extended beyond a single incident, touching on how society records, stores, and connects information about the most vulnerable. Past lack of interstate data connectivity, lax management of child records, and over-reliance on personal explanations created gaps through which an individual could vanish without a trace for decades. Today's system improvements, from national databases to mandatory reporting processes, are direct results of such painful lessons, but Richard's story reminds us that these reforms only have meaning if maintained with ongoing vigilance, because every generation risks repeating past mistakes in new forms. At the same time, the case raised questions about how society understands and defines justice, when legal justice could not be completed, but truth was still clarified, forcing us to acknowledge that in some cases, justice does not arrive as a verdict, but as recognition and remembrance. For the Price family, the greatest meaning lay not in who was punished, but in the fact that Richard was no longer a name frozen in files, but a person with presence, however belated. For Richard, knowing who he was did not erase the losses, but allowed him to place his life in a more coherent narrative, where the prolonged feelings of displacement finally had an explanation, even if not a comfortable one. On a broader level, this story delivered a concluding message that was not simply comforting, but cautionary, that every unresolved disappearance is a story waiting to be heard, and that systemic silence does not mean truth has vanished. It reminds us that technology, memory, and societal responsibility must go hand in hand, because relying on only one will leave gaps continuing to exist. The question of the real perpetrator in Richard Price's case may never be answered, but the very fact that the question continues to be asked has become part of the case's lasting meaning, because it refuses to let the matter be reduced to a tidy ending. Instead, this story exists as a reminder that truth can be found very late, that justice can be incomplete, and that the greatest value of investigating cold cases sometimes lies not in closing every question, but in restoring voice to people once forgotten by the system. In that imperfection, Richard Price's story is not simply a solved case, but evidence of society's capacity to look back at itself, acknowledge limits, learn from mistakes, and keep seeking truth, even knowing that some answers will forever remain out of reach. Richard Price's story, from a 9-year-old boy who disappeared in Georgia in 1955 to a man rediscovered after 70 years, clearly reflects issues that American society today still faces, even though the context has changed profoundly. The first lesson comes from Richard's very disappearance, an unusual moment downplayed, an assumption of probably just an accident in the early hours, and a system then lacking data connectivity, were enough for a child to fall out of society's sight for decades. In modern life, where technology has advanced far more, this story reminds us that human vigilance remains just as important as systems, because every database or process only has value when people are willing to ask questions early and seriously. The second lesson lies in Richard's journey growing up under a different identity, living off the grid, lacking original documents, and a clear history, left silent psychological wounds, manifesting as feelings of displacement, avoidance of the past, and identity crises in adulthood. This highlights a very real issue in the United States today, where many children in foster care, immigration, or alternative care systems still risk losing connection to their origins if records and identity are not fully protected. The third lesson comes from the DNA and case reopening phase. Modern technology can bring truth back to light, but it cannot fully replace legal justice or completely heal losses that have already occurred. Richard's reunion with the Price family brought truth but also exposed unbridgeable gaps when his parents had passed away and his childhood had been stolen. From this, the story sends a very practical message to American society today. Invest not only in investigative technology, but in early prevention, protecting children through transparent, interconnected, and humane systems, while acknowledging that justice lies not only in verdicts, but also in ensuring no one is forgotten long enough for truth to return only after half a century. If Richard Price's story has made you reflect on the value of truth and the fates once forgotten, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring cold cases that have never been fully told. Thank you for watching to the very end, and see you in the next video, where every story reminds us that no one should be left forgotten in silence.